more than 2 decades ago, we did, I don't know what to call it. We did something. Four of us set out based on a conceptual framework which had four words in it: no agenda, no ambition. And those phrases were framed by a friend, Shiva, now who's in Myanmar. And we basically used to hang out as, we didn't even call ourselves researchers. We didn't know where we were headed, honestly speaking. But we didn't mind doing what we were doing, correct? So the process started in Goa, right?
Yeah.
Something like Goa. And the idea was basically to saunter down from Goa all the way to the Trivandrum, not knowing where you're going, but not rushing also, and just being there, spending time, and learning everywhere we went. And so it was a kind of a narcissistic project in some ways, because we are just sucking in, right? And we're not giving back anything. So everywhere we went, people would speak with us, and we didn't know where we were going to sleep that night, what our next day's plan was, but or transport. And quite a few times we would end up walking on the beach, and it felt nice when the sun was blasting down and the feet were getting nicely roasted below. Tandoor was happening out of you. Uh, but the funny thing is this, that when we sat down to actually write down what we had written, what we had absorbed, even now I'm deconstructing what I had learned, even now. And I was just telling Suresh just a minute ago that those spaces have transformed. It's gone through its own metamorphosis. And what we did was, we were walking through villages which had been like that for quite a few generations. And probably it is in our lifetimes, we are seeing a metamorphosis which has never been witnessed for several centuries. You see, and that metamorphosis is not just physical, it's in every dimension. For instance, I keep going towards the west coast now and then. I went to Karwar recently. There's an island off the coast of Karwar where there are a couple of cabins there. I won't tell you where it is. You can take a boat, and I won't tell you where the boat leaves. And then you basically go there, and there are two guys who take care of you. You can stay there for as long as you want. You pay them some money. And from there, when you see the mainland, right, it's remarkable beauty. And that is where Rabindranath Tagore actually went. And he called Karwar, I forget what he called it, but he basically had grandiose terms to describe the beauty of that place. And where Tagore sat and looked at the sea and looked at the wildlife around and looked at the grandeur of the forests, and that's where one point where the Western Ghats goes and dives deep into the sea. Everywhere else there is a little narrow coastline. Today there is the naval base. And when we went there 25 years ago, the naval base was being proposed, and we met the impacted communities. But today if you go, and as I went recently, you don't see any impacted communities anymore. It's like they're gone. We don't know where they are. 25 kilometers of coastline was taken for the naval base. And in a very sort of a peculiar way, I get connected to that naval base. That's where the submarines leave. And we have nukes now in nuclear submarines, right? And we have nukes in the nuclear submarines. So it's like a double whammy, as they call it. Recently, a submarine blew up in near Trombay, and 30-40 sailors died. We don't know what happened, right? But imagine a nuclear submarine with a nuke in it going around our coastline. It's supposed to protect us, right? But there are these tremendous accidents that take place. But when we met the fishing communities that time and asked them, do you know what is coming here? All they knew was defense, right? And Navy, of course. They didn't know what was coming there. So it kind of, when I look back at that time from today, and I look at the communities who lived there, it is probably one of the most beautiful coastlines you can imagine. The entire Karwar coastline. Because there's Agnashini that comes in, there is Kali that comes in. It forms an amazing, amazing complex of vegetation, of aquatic life, and of landforms. And in that, a little city called Karwar, very, very sleepy town at that time. But if you went there now, is bustling with activity. Those communities have disappeared. Those landforms have disappeared. The river comes, but you don't know where the river is going into the sea. It's kind of, you see it, but you don't really experience it. So that is the power of urbanization in many ways. That is the power of infrastructure development. That is the enormous power of transformation that it has. So you can do great wonders with it, but you can also mess up a place. Uh, so my question has always been, at that time, George Fernandez was really pushing, later George Fernandez pushed for even as defense minister. But before that, George Fernandez pushed for the Konkan Railway. And when we were traveling down, it was the Konkan Railway which was the issue there. And I don't know if you recall, Madhav Gadgil, for instance, wrote extensively about the implications of the Konkan Railway and so on. Sridharan, who now rebuilds cities. I don't know if you know this, but Sridharan is rebuilding cities, multiple cities. And through the course of the day, I'll explain my own experience of understanding what Sridharan's role has been in rebuilding cities. Okay. At that time, he was rebuilding the coastline. It was a vision that he had of how the coast has to be understood. And his vision of understanding the coast was, he saw when he stood there, a beautiful coastline, a National Highway 7 which was running alongside, one of the most beautiful national highways now it is all cluttered, right? But when it was built, the National Highway, it snaked along the coast, right? So I don't know if you have had the experience of driving down the coast anywhere, but if you did, one of the most surreal experiences that you can have is to have the sea on one side and mountains on the other side. Okay, it's very rare in the world that you can actually get that experience, except in some coastlines. In most coastlines, there are no mountains. There is a flat land. For instance, Africa, if you drive, you can drive for like days and it's just flat land. Or even much of the eastern part of the United States. But if you went to the western part of North America, it's grander, right? So nature has shaped land for multiple reasons in particular ways, and we tend to inhabit those spaces. And we have inhabited the coastline most dynamically over time. And for centuries, the West Coast has been a zone of great trade and enterprise. You'll find hundreds of little ports through which people traded, made their lives and livelihoods. All sorts of wars fought, and people were, for instance, my ancestry is also got to do with the conversions that took place in the 14th, 15th century. And so, your life gets reshaped. And when I look at Karwar today, right, what do I see? Do I see Sridharan building the metro, the Konkan Railway? Or do I see the Indian Navy having built its massive naval base? Or do I see on the landward side an amazing metamorphosis where land has got financialized so much that what were basically tiled roof structures in a very sleepy town, which had a little port, which was one of the functional ports of the West Coast for a very long time, a natural port also, has suddenly transformed into a maze of glass, aluminum, and steel constructions. And then you wonder, in a generation, where are those people who had continued to have a certain kind of life? Okay, so this hits you when you're coming into the coast from that island. And one of the questions that comes to my mind is, what choice did those people have against the forces that were being brought to transform that zone? And my question to Sridharan, if I would meet him, is, did you actually only see a railway line, or do you see people around? Right? I am not arguing against a railway line. I'm just arguing about how do you construct a vision of the future if you are a Sridharan. Or later on, George Fernandez actually went and convinced the people to let go, and because there was a lot of resistance and a lot of conflict, obviously, when you're torn away from, when you take fishing communities and dump them on a hill, right, where do you park your boats? Right, especially if it is a security zone. If the coastline of 25 kilometers is itself physically taken out and out of bounds for you, then there is an exclusion zone behind that. And that would be 2-3 kilometers on either side. So, who decides the reshaping of this? right? And when you plan for others, do you need to be sensitive at all? Or is it that planning by itself is a hubristic enterprise where you just, kind of use your training, if you have sound training, that is, or if the lack of training is a limitation, you cover it up by claiming that you have training. Now, when I say training, training doesn't mean you know. Training means, for me, that you're capable of listening and understanding a terrain and knowing how to revision it and capture with sensitivity what that space can do for future. Because one thing that is fixed is space. You cannot change it. Right? So all our human enterprise is all about, it's a conquest over space. We're all the time fighting for territory. Right? If Trump is building a wall, he's trying to fix territory and saying this is mine. Right? As we do with our neighbors here and so on. So when you have territory and you have contestation over territory, how do you actually negotiate the issues? What are the factors that outweigh other factors? What is the process by which you govern that space? How do you make it inclusive? Now, the idea of inclusivity is a very modern idea, is what we presume, because we had the constitution, and so in the constitution, idea of inclusivity came in, and therefore we now say it is a right-based idea of inclusivity. Of course, the fact that it is not delivered is a different matter. But if we were to actually go into the idea of inclusivity, as the constitution has given us, and then look at, again, let's say Karwar, and ask if that was the method of planning, would the defense forces or the land use planning forces or the panchayats or the nagarpalikas work very differently? Or was the idea of exclusivity with which planners typically operate? And that's why planning tends to be very hubristic. It's like more like, I know what you want, rather than let me find out what you want. So these are the conflicts that are going on. And this is a conflict that is intensely played out on the coastline of India. And Karwar is just an example of it. You can go any part of Indian coastline now. These contestations are going on. And you will see these contestations across urban India as well. So I feel that in our journey through this terrain of urban commons, urban governance, one of our biggest challenges is to capture the density of imaginations that have been there over that space. Not just our imagination, but the density of imaginations. For instance, Karwar, the idea of inclusivity was not limited to post-independent India. That space was inclusive by culture. The fishing communities had created probably the most beautiful network of traditions to govern the commons. As you see in commons in dryland areas. And I'll later on explain to you one of the other points of contestations that we are engaged in over a science city. And what you find is that communities, especially those who are intricately linked to land and landscapes, have such a rich understanding of what that space has to mean. And you cannot absorb it and put it into a map. Once you put it into a map, you erase so many histories, so many patterns, so many experiential accounts of that space, which can never, and now more recently what we have done in the last 10 years is, if you go to any planning department, they will ask you if you have GIS experience. Like for instance, I don't know if you've been there or you're working in those sectors, but if you did, one of the planning tools today is they give you a little instrument and they tell you go and find out what is happening there. But when you actually ask them, what have you found out? They have found out the point, they have measured the terrain, but they have not captured the history, the culture, and the tradition of that space because there is no possibility in that technology. So I have a friend who actually does software with a difference. So he's got a software called Follow the Sheep. Now you won't find Microsoft following the sheep, right? But so he does follow the sheep. I said, what does the software do? So he says he gives this device to the same device to a shepherd, and the narrative is completely different. The narrative is not about a rocky outcrop, about a stream flowing. It's about, I found grass here. This grass is denser. This grass is woody. That grass is softer. You see, it's how your experience forms your perspective. So in his perspective, a shepherd's perspective, he is looking for pasture land, right? And he's not seeing the landform as you and I would see it. The same way a fishing community would not see the commons as just wasteland, which is what an engineer would see. For instance, you raise Puduvaipin, right? For the engineers, and I ended up meeting the engineers along with Pradhan, who was the Minister of Petroleum, along with a few of your friends from Kerala. The IOC chairman was there in that meeting. And we're sitting in a room like this, and you could very clearly see how your experience of a place transforms you, informs you, and instructs what you say also. For the IOC people, there is just wasteland. It is unproductive wasteland, that Vibin Island. And now we are going to make it productive by putting a lot of petrochemical complexes. Whereas when you are a fishing community representative, your narrative is completely different. You see, so space becomes not a neutral idea. Space is largely a response to your own life experience, as what Suresh and I would experience now if we went back and retraced our own journey from Goa all the way to Trivandrum. We would experience the space in the sense of our own history of that place. So one of the biggest challenges that we today have is how do we help cities function and accommodate the different imaginations that different people have with their different experiences. And it is possible. Just take water, right? You take this glass, okay? And you put a couple of, pieces of vegetable in it and leave it for a couple of days. It starts decomposing, right? And you fill it with half the vegetables. It will decompose. It will stink faster because the amount of oxygen that is required to digest it is lesser now because the space for water is also less, right? And the so-called dissolved oxygen, which helps keep water fresh, is gone. The point is that the more organic matter there is, let's not use garbage because garbage then brings plastics and other things. Just take any organic matter, right? And there is a lot of organic matter around the lake. There are agricultural fields, there are woodlands, there are leaf litter, and all of that will wash into the lake system, right? And it doesn't go float off. It will sit in the bottom. It sits in the bottom, it starts decomposing and it turns into what is called anaerobic decomposition. Okay, that means decomposition without water. The life forms in the water changes. The bacteria which survives when there is a high amount of oxygen which is dissolved in the water cannot survive anymore, and the bacteria which thrives with a low amount of oxygen will take over. Their population will increase, and then they'll knock off the first bacteria. So that's called anaerobic decomposition. Now that's not a good thing for us because it also creates a disease burden in our stomach because it infects the water. Now this was way before the microscope came, and these technologies were built over thousands of years. They had observed that if you deepen too much, then the water that comes out is impure. But if it is shallow, the water is pure. So you will never find a lake which is deep. You'll find it between 15 to 20 feet by and large, maybe 25 feet. But then you look at our engineers, they also go and create lakes. You'll find lakes which are 50 feet deep, 40 feet deep, and dams, of course, forget it. 150 feet deep, 200 feet deep, 300 feet deep, and so on. What we are doing is we are actually making good, clean water impure and infectious. Because the simple act of sunlight, no, it's the best disinfectant. It keeps killing off the bad germs and keeps the water alive. Ultraviolet rays which comes in works. It's free supply. You just have to take advantage of it. So, the way in which these technologies were evolved, a simple water technology was to ensure that flowing water can be arrested, just enough for this neighborhood, and the excess can flow over, and then you build another one, and then that goes through the next one, and so on. So you create a network of water harvesting systems. But the amazing thing is you're only seeing water here. But a shepherd sees something totally different. This water will be used, it is arrested during the rainfall, and then you have a second crop, the winter crop, when it doesn't rain. So you are increasing food security. The farmer can now produce 2 crops instead of just 1 if it was rain fed. Okay? But when the second crop is growing, this water level reduces. What do you think the space becomes then? Then water level dries off. What is there in the soil? Huh? Fertility is there, of course. But there is no water. But there's moisture, no? What happens when soil has moisture? What comes out first? Huh? Grass, right? Grass is a colonizing plant. It comes, it starts, it flourishes. And what does it create now? See, the interesting thing is this. They had built into this simple wall the possibility of multiple fishing communities, farming communities, pastoral communities. All 3 thrive on that. And across South India. If I was in Bombay and I went to the museum in Bombay, you must visit it. It's an amazing museum. They have one section on the Harappan civilization. And if I told you till 1970 this technology sustained Bangalore, would you believe me? Because Bangalore thrived on lakes. Bangalore was built on the idea of harvesting water like this and living off such structures from the 15th century, 16th century till the 20th century, till 1971, when there was a demand to tap Kaveri water. And that water comes from 100 kilometers away. Now, one of the arguments we are making is, can we go back to these systems and can we reclaim the spaces which, as you said, has been dumped by garbage? Our sewage, every time you flush your toilet, it's going into the lake. It ends up in the lake, one way or the other. And it is contaminating what were life-enhancing systems, livelihood-supporting systems, have been transformed into death and decay systems. You are with me on this? Yeah? So the reason I'm saying this is because you also have to understand it from a different perspective, the idea of the commons. Joseph Sachs wrote this seminal paper in the Michigan Law Review in 1972. It's online, you can download it, where he looks at the idea of the commons. Okay, and he goes into the historical account of how the commons have been shaped and protected. And that, in the Western notion, goes to the Roman times. And the Romans developed something called the doctrine of public trust. Have you read the doctrine of public trust? Which is now law in India. In 1996, Justice Kuldeep Singh, in response to a petition by M.C. Mehta, invoked the doctrine of public trust, which was employed by the Romans for 3,000 years then already. And he said, the entire way in which we have to envision the country should be from the doctrine of public trust. Not just a lake, the entire country. So Supreme Court rulings apply across the country, right? And it has not been shaken. The doctrine of public trust has not been shaken since then. So this is what they call judge-made law, where judiciary interprets and invokes certain principles and makes it part of our common system of legality. Have you sort of browsed the Constitution by any chance? It's a book which is kind of around, usually in libraries. is a book which if you end up in National Law University in Delhi, you get it free. Okay, either you are a participant in the course or you're in some way participating in that program, they'll give you a copy of the Constitution of India. It's so well produced, that book. I carry it around as my red Bible. Uh, and it is made of rice paper also. You can actually smell the rice. Now, the reason I asked is because we all in our lives try to construct something, no? And like in a building, in this building for instance, what is holding the building up? It's the walls, right? Really? Only the walls? It's a foundation, no? Which you don't see. It's invisible. Our constitution is like that. So once in a while you have to check and see if the foundation is there. Otherwise you're on a shaky ground. Now, can I ask you a question? I don't know if you're familiar, it's okay. If you're not, it's also fine. Can you tell me, you have not understood the doctrine of public trust, no? Have you, any of you? No? Okay. So, who explained? It's okay. It doesn't matter. These are, huh? Yeah, okay. So, basically, let's just look at the doctrine of public trust. See, what it says is, there are 3 rules in the doctrine of public trust. It belongs to nobody, but everybody owns it. The street belongs to nobody, but everybody owns it. Users particular to that space allowed. Will you go and put a temple inside a street? But is it a use particular to that space? Isn't it? Right? That's encroaching a public space. It's a kind of an imposition on that space, and arm twisting somebody, and basically showing muscle. It's a majoritarian view of things. In simple terms, in Hindi, we'll call it dadagiri. When you put a temple or a mosque or a church, whatever it may be, depending on the culture of that region, right? But generally, a space is a place where everybody can use it. But the use has to be particular to that space. You cannot create a swimming pool in a street, right? Now, the third one, that space cannot be traded for any type of consideration, including monetary. Any type of consideration, including monetary. That means you cannot sell a street. Can you sell a street? If suppose the municipality of Hyderabad chose to sell the street just outside the building, we are locked in, no? We are imprisoned. These were the 3 principles on which the Romans decided how to build Rome. Because they had problems, right? Because rules were not being shaped. There are all sorts of confusions. And confusion sometimes lead to conflict. Conflict leads to, swords and this thing. Like Jackie Chan movies, it all happens, and then finally people die and people get hurt, and I said enough is enough. Let's try and figure out what we are trying to do with space. Okay? And they codified into the public trust doctrine. And it took us till 1996, till Kuldeep Singh responded to MC Mehta's petition. You know why? You have heard of Kamal Nath, no? He's now going to be Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister. He hopes to. But at that time he was the Environment Minister. Huh? Sorry?
Sticking a neck out on that.
I'm not sticking my, he hopes to, I said. But with 70%, 80% turnout, I don't know what it means for Chavan. And though he's from Madhya Pradesh, he's a well-to-do guy. He's managed to get a lot of money. And in Himachal, there's a river, I forget the name of the river. He decided to build a resort. Now, there's no problem if you build a resort on private space, right? It's allowed. But he didn't have the advantage of the river. Because, it's a nice thing if you have a resort which is next to a river, no? Your value goes up. So what this fellow did, he is Environment Minister. He went and put a little diversion to the river and diverted the river past his resort. Now what do you think he did? It's private property? A river is a private property generally? Ganga is private property? No, the diversion was private property. Yeah. So the river is commons, right? Right? Now just look at a river with these 3 principles. It belongs to nobody, but everybody owns it. You own the Ganga as if she's your mother, right? G.D. Agarwal, who died after 117 days of fasting, if you read his letter, he writes as if he is Ganga's child. Mataji he calls. Day after tomorrow we are going to have a workshop in Bangalore trying to see why the Prime Minister was not shaken by an old man who was fasting for the 170th, 17th day and chooses to allow him to die, the Prime Minister of India. This is his third letter. He has written already two more. And you should read the Jairam Ramesh's interview day before yesterday. This is not the first time Agarwal has fasted for the Ganga. He did it a decade ago. At that time, Jairam Ramesh was the environment minister. When he started fasting, Manmohan Singh picked up the phone and said, "Look, I cannot go, but can you go?" And he's given a detailed account of what happened. He went there, met with the man, stayed with him for 2 days. He says, "We want you to stop. Why are you fasting?" He said, "Look, don't build that dam." And they actually agreed to stop building a dam. Okay, why was he fasting? Was it for himself? He was trying to protect the river system. And there is a deeper logic to it why you should not build dams in the Himalayan rivers and so on. But let's not get into that. But he was saying, it belongs to me. I may not own it. And you're doing something wrong with it. I want you to stop doing it. And the only way I can persuade you is morally. Because legality is not going to work here. He went beyond legality. Because you get into a legal argument with the government will say, we have the right under this law, that law, and so on, and constructs an argument. Matter ends up in court. And then the court has to decide based on legality. Like is now happening in the Kaveri river system. Because Bangalore is running out of water, and we are going to build yet another dam in one of the most beautiful parts of the Kaveri. It's called Mekedatu. It's such a charming place. If you've been there, you'll realize it. Right? It's a gorge which has been carved over millions of years. And that gorge is going to be dammed, and you'll never see a gorge after. You'll just see placid waters. You'll not see what is lost. Right? And like the Narmada has been lost and so on. But for G.D. Agarwal, the question was, it belongs to me in a spiritual sense, belongs to me. So, it suddenly brings in a sacred dimension to something called a river. It is not just public property. There's also a sacred connect to it. See, commons have this thing that they do with you, right? It's your interpretation. And it accommodates that interpretation. It cannot be trained. If you are an artist, you will see a beautiful river. But if you are a spiritual person, you will actually see God. And it is not illegal to see God in that. There is a paper written by Ivan Illich. If we have published it, I don't have an online version. I can send it later. It's called H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. It's by Ivan Illich. He is a philosopher who passed away a couple of decades ago. He taught across many universities in the US. So you know why he constructs the title of the paper this way? What is H2O? That's what you want to say. But what is H2O? If I say H2SO4, so you're basically saying names of chemicals, no? Hydrogen sulfide, yeah. It's that very nice gas which you wear on yourself. Yeah. Because it smells like rotten eggs. It comes in bottles. They don't sell it. Please don't buy it. It will not be very popular if you wear that perfume. You have just mentioned names of chemicals, no? So when you actually look at water today across the world, including in bottles which you see like that, you are seeing H2O. But there is a deeper dimension to that. And the waters of forgetfulness is sacred. And the sacred dimension is what many people see. So there was this spectacular photograph of the Yamuna, which has been going around, where you see this foam like icebergs. And a few devotees, a kid is going there and taking a dip inside it. It's just outside of Delhi. Is he seeing H2O or sacred? So you see, what I'm saying is the public trust doctrine accommodates this interpretation. It doesn't box it. It allows you to imagine what you want to imagine. But it also says, use it in a way that you want to use it, okay, fine. You can go and worship the river, but don't dump all your flowers into it. Because then it takes away the use particular to the river, which is fishing. It destroys fishing. Don't dump all your industrial effluents into it. You take it, use it. But have the responsibility not to dump your waste back. And here I must go back to the Harappan civilization. Every house had a well, which means water was found. So you didn't have to walk. There were no women and children exploited, which is typical in most cities in India. and they would walk. And as a kid, I grew up in a lower income neighborhood. We didn't have piped water supply. So part of our everyday ritual in the morning was get up early, like 3 or 4 in the morning, and run to a public fountain and capture water. It was like you have to capture water. You have to actually jostle. And as a kid, I could go under somebody's legs and come up in the front of the line and capture a space so I can get a pot of water. So we grew up doing that. Today we don't do that. Today we open and the water comes in because we have piped water supply. Because my parents have worked hard and I have worked, I guess, hopefully hard and managed to get into a space where I don't have to do that anymore. So I bought myself the luxury of having piped water supply. But finally, what was that experience for me? Every morning waking up to go run 200, 300 meters, be in line, get a few pots of water, right? And that's happening in the 20th century. But in 3000 BC, they had built a city in which every house had its own well, right? And it had its own toilet also. And the engineering of the toilet was such, you've seen this kamba, as they call it, which we now use to compost waste at home, which was a design that was evolved in Bangalore. What they would do is the toilet would flush and the solid material, the silt, would stay in the pots, and only the pots would have pores. Out of the pores would come out the liquid part and flow through closed drains to a space where it would drain out and not contaminate any of the water systems. Is it too difficult for us to construct cities like that today? Because every house had it. They had an upper city and a lower city. The upper city was for the elite and the lower city was for the working class, but everybody had toilets. Today cities are constructed as upper class people get toilets, get water, piped water, the best piped water. The lower end of the spectrum doesn't. And it has to become such a big issue, not just the Prime Minister, but the whole world is talking about it. But we had solved that problem 6,000 years ago. So what it was also an imagination of how you use the public space, because had that waste gone, had the toilets not been provided in Harappan civilization, just imagine what would have happened to the lakes. People would have to go, no? Like people go, millions of people go out in the mornings. Everywhere you walk, you will find shit. Typical experience in any little town, village, anywhere in India. You walk out of the town early morning and you'll feel you see the horrendous pain of women having to hide their shame because they're all along this road. So how do you imagine life for all of us? So the public trust doctrine, though it's simple, it actually provides you a lot of insight into how you construct space. How do you construct space where everybody can use, everybody can live, everybody can have livelihoods, everybody can have water and toilets, and yet send the waste that they cannot manage themselves out in a way that it doesn't contaminate the public space. Because when water which is not got silt in it goes out, it's easier to treat. Aerobic digestion can take place. Sunlight can work on it. But the minute you put organic matter, like you saw it in the lake systems, right? If you make it too deep, organic matter sits there and starts digesting and contaminates the water. You make it shallow, the sunlight works on it, dissolved oxygen works on it, life works on it. Because when there is dissolved oxygen, there can be fish. There can be microbial life, which digests the whole thing. Simple thinking, right? And profound impact. But also it's a certain value in which you say, I want to live in a way without trespassing on somebody else's territory. So the public trust doctrine provides you that imagination. And all this is happening without any monetary value attached to it. The minute you start looking at that resource as what can I get out of it, I get out of it. The minute I comes, I becomes money. Money becomes territory. And that's what's happening to most cities in India. So it's that value system which has to be worked on.